Coming up on a Humankind special, how are we processing this state of near relentless chaos? From the hurricanes and wildfires to the threat to democracy, to the pandemic, to the savagery in Ukraine, we'll listen to people who have undergone these crises, as well as to healthcare professionals and clergy who can help us gain perspective.
I think there has to be fundamental work right now on compassion and empathy, to not try to wrap it up in a happy bow, talk people out of their suffering, to just be present with them in it. And I think that's how we discover our way into a next chapter.
How do we sit with the uncertainties that surround us? What are good practices for the care of our neighbors and for self-care? Where are the sources of hope? I'm David Freudberg. Stay with us for our documentary Constant Emergency from Humankind. Humankind is produced in association with WGBH Boston and Documentary Educational Resources. This special project, Constant Emergency, is supported by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation and by the Humankind Program Fund. As world crises pile up, what personal skills can help us to work through them? You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. From the pandemic to climate change, the epidemic of gun violence to our very democracy at stake, we seem to have entered an age of relentless chaos. At times, it can feel like we're experiencing whiplash from a multi-car collision. So I've been asking what resources are needed for emotional and physical health and for the functioning of our communities to help people navigate this season of storms.
I like to think that we could be like the immune system on the planet at this time.
Nicole Warwick works with the Sonoma Community Resilience Collaborative in a region that has faced multiple devastating wildfires north of San Francisco.
I've definitely not given up hope. I don't think that the end of times is near, but I do think that this is a moment that's calling upon us to respond, and we can choose to keep going, to kind of have our blinders on and to not change, or we can take the courage to be the immune system of the planet and for each other at this time.
The COVID pandemic, which claimed the lives of more than 1 million Americans and over 6 million worldwide, has deeply unsettled our sense of well-being. This prolonged period of endangerment has produced a classic stress reaction.
In general, people are more on edge.
Physician James Gordon of Georgetown University.
They're in a state of ongoing fight or flight, many of them. I mean, this fight or flight response is a survival response that's meant to come quickly and go quickly and be in our lives, built into our biology to preserve us from predators. And of course, in human beings, we have fight or flight when we feel psychologically threatened. Well, I think very large numbers of people are continuing in fight or flight. And the other part of what's going on is that they may not even realize it.
Dr. Gordon is a psychiatrist and founder of the Center for Mind-Body Medicine in Washington, D.C. He has helped populations to heal from aching trauma. These include survivors of the incomprehensible hail of bullets sprayed by a young shooter at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida on Valentine's Day 2018. Student activist Emma Gonzalez.
In a little over 6 minutes, 17 of our friends were taken from us, 15 were injured, and everyone, absolutely everyone, in the Douglas community was forever altered.
Living through terrorism leaves a particular kind of scar. And during these troubled times, people in many circumstances develop the symptoms of trauma.
Well, they're reacting from a place of unrelenting chronic fear.
Psychotherapist Sabrina Njai, based in Baltimore, is a senior faculty member at the Center for Mind-Body Medicine.
And what that looks like sometimes is violence against the self and violence against other people. And sometimes that violence is physical in these mass shootings. And sometimes that violence is is emotional in the way we speak to ourselves. And sometimes it's both.
The way we speak to ourselves.
To ourselves, yes, absolutely. From a place of judgment, of blame, of dislike of ourselves, which then certainly flows from the self out to the outside world. And it's showing up with people being in separation from each other, in a decreased capacity for trust and decreased hope. And of course, decreased hope lends itself to physical disruptions, to chronic illness, to loss of life.
We've been working with the U.S. Capitol Police.
Dr. James Gordon.
And, of course, on January 6th, 2021, they had an extremely traumatic episode when they were sort of overwhelmed by the rioters, and they were ill-equipped, and many of them were physically but also psychologically damaged.
Here's Michael Fanone, a D.C. Metropolitan Police officer who was summoned to the Capitol that day and has since resigned.
As I was swarmed by a violent mob, they ripped off my badge. They grabbed and stripped me of my radio. They seized ammunition that was secured to my body. They began to beat me with their fists and with what felt like hard metal objects.
Just about all of them say they're more on edge. They have some difficulty sleeping. They have some difficulty focusing. And occasionally, they are having frank panic attacks when they can't get their breath. Now, those are people with an obvious source of the trauma. But the rest of us, I've noticed among my colleagues and my friends that there's a little more uneasiness than I've ordinarily seen, a little more tendency to react and react sharply when there's any kind of questioning or any kind of threat. And I can see it in myself.
Adding to the crisis atmosphere are hazards posed by global climate change. The accumulation of heat-trapping gases in our atmosphere has intensified the effects of hurricanes, scorching heat, droughts, and floods, all of which impacts agriculture, which can affect price and availability of our food at the grocery store. And nowhere have the ravages of the changing climate been on more vivid display than in the infernos sparked by wildfires in California.
And then I'll assume command shortly. We do have a major fire. Stand by for a very significant resource request.
Generated copies. Our priority is rescue of the public and safety of the rescuer. Suppression, where possible.
First responders speed through a hellscape of floating ash and winds as the Northern California night is lit up by bright yellow-orange blazes that burn for miles.
In 2017, the Tubbs fire came through Santa Rosa.
Melissa Barnett is a yoga teacher who works with special needs families. Her story is harrowing, but also offers seeds of hope.
And I was fortunately not in my space. I was out in another county. And when the fire happened, I then worked towards getting back to my house. And once I was able to, I discovered that it had been burnt to the ground. That was everything burnt to the ground. That was the building. That was the trees. Everything, the contents in the building.
What was your visceral reaction to that loss?
Fire is shocking. It's, the ash was in the air. I was breathing the ash. The steps were there leading to the door, but the door wasn't there. So it was this eerie, strange feeling with this dark sky and this air I couldn't breathe. And the one thing that survived was a beautiful statue I had that I put on my altar, and she was in the midst of the fire. She survived. So it was this kind of a spiritual feeling like we can survive these events.
The Tubbs Fire in October 2017 was the most destructive wildfire in the history of California to that date. According to CAL FIRE, more than 230,000 acres burned. Over 50,000 people were evacuated. 44 people died. After the tragedy, several community organizations started meeting to explore ways to help the survivors. Nicole Warwick.
This is really typical after the fires or major trauma in a community where people start to come together and start asking these questions of how do we support our community now that we've gone through this unprecedented trauma. And Santa Rosa Community Health, Daily Acts, which is the organization I work for, and several other key organizations here in Sonoma County convened and formed the Sonoma Community Resilience Collaborative. And the goal was to be able to resource support, to be able to aid our community in transitioning and healing from the trauma we had experienced.
The collaborative brought in experts from the Center for Mind-Body Medicine in Washington. Hundreds of people went through a training for how to diminish the effects of trauma and stress. From there, the skills would be adapted to efforts intended to promote greater resilience in the face of climate impacts.
Emotions are evoked within us when we're in our environments, natural environments or environments we choose to go visit. And our emotions can range from a feeling of connection and belonging and affinity to this space. We can feel comforted being in certain environments. So other environments can stimulate feelings of deep relaxation. Now, when we're dealing with climate catastrophes, much like we're doing, the fires here, or if we look to the hurricanes, the emotions become more intense and extreme. There's a lot of discussion around climate anxiety, but I think when we name just the anxiety piece, we're limiting ourselves because we have a full spectrum of emotions around our environment and climate, things that range from love all the way to grief and fear can exist within us when we're navigating climate change at this time.
Do you find a lot of people are walking around with fear there?
I believe so. I believe there's a lot of unmetabolized fear happening, under-recognized fear happening, and we have a lot of people whose nervous systems are just completely overstimulated by the stress of what's happening without a proper container or ways to articulate what their feelings are around the fear.
Ready for additional evacuation orders?
Tubbs IC, St. Helena, affirmative.
Evacuate from Sonoma County, Calistoga Road, and Harville Road, east of the city of Calistoga, and all adjoining roads, Porter Creek.
So I live in a forested area in West Sonoma County, and we've encountered fires in our community now almost every year for the last 5 years. And in 2020, we had a very large fire that was the closest one in proximity to where I live. And we evacuated for 10 days. And when we came back into the forest, my perception of the forest had shifted. This was a place that had given me a great sense of calm and belonging. I felt this deep connection to the land. And when I came back after being evacuated and the threat of fire had been so real and close in proximity, my perception of the forest had shifted, and the things that I once had seen as green and lush felt like fuel for fire. And my nervous system was on high alert. I wasn't sleeping well. Whenever the winds would rustle through the trees or we had a really hot day, I could feel it in my body. My whole system was on alert and afraid to be in the forest. And it took me a long time to be able to identify that feeling, the panic that would come up and having to understand what was happening for me in my own body being in this place. And then how could I take actions to support myself to remain? Whether or not I actually stayed was a question for me, and I had lived in that place for 18 years. I didn't want to leave my home. I loved those woods. But the fear was so primal and so real and in my body that I had a very hard time being there.
So we've been talking about some pretty rough stuff, and I have to ask whether any of this has shaken your personal faith.
Of course it does. On some level, isn't that what it's meant to do? When a major life catastrophe or situation happens, it usually reveals to us parts of ourselves that we need to remember, our strengths, our resources, our vulnerabilities, the parts of us that we've been working to heal, to be able to just acknowledge those things about ourselves and to maybe even set new aspirations or new ways of growing and being in the world.
We're exploring how people come to terms with various calamities in an age of trauma and how they can find ways to heal. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. For more information on this segment, Constant Emergency, and to obtain audio downloads or CDs, please visit humanmedia.org. Dr. James Gordon, the Georgetown psychiatrist who founded the Center for Mind-Body Medicine, has made several recent trips to the tragic region of Ukraine. His mission has been to offer pathways to people who've endured Russia's brutal, unprovoked invasion starting in February 2022.
The major work is in Ukraine and with Ukrainian refugees. There are several million who've passed through Poland. The work is training people who are formerly caregivers, like doctors and mental health professionals, but also training people who want to be helpful to others. So, for example, a lot of the people we train are teachers. We train clergy. We train peer counselors, teaching them techniques of self-care, how to become more self-aware, giving them the experience of these approaches, and then teaching them how to use what they've learned with others.
So how does a person become more self-aware?
Partly by shutting up for a couple minutes, just as you had us do. You said, can we be quiet with each other for a minute or so before we begin the interview? I think that's a beautiful way to do it. And we do this before every one of our staff meetings at the Center for Mind-Body Medicine. Just shut up, take a few deep breaths, slow deep breaths, with the belly soft and relaxed, maybe with the eyes closed. Perhaps focusing on the breath, on the belly softening and relaxing, and on the words soft as we breathe in and belly as we breathe out. Technically, and people who are listening should continue doing this while I'm talking, technically this is a concentrative meditation. What this does is it balances out the fight or flight response. It mobilizes the vagus nerve, which is the antidote to the fight or flight response. It lowers blood pressure, slows heart rate, relaxes the big muscles in our body, improves our digestion, and also quiets areas of the brain in the amygdala, amygdala, which means almond in Greek. It's an almond-shaped portion of the brain and the emotional part of the brain, which is responsible for fear and anger. So when you breathe slowly and deeply like this, you quiet activity in the amygdala. And as you do that, you also bring on more activity in the frontal cortex of the brain, areas responsible for thoughtful decision-making and self-awareness and clear thinking and compassion. So it's a very simple way to bring us into balance so that we can become aware of what's actually going on and how we're actually feeling, and of the difference between our immediate, perhaps, reaction to a situation that would happen if we're still in fight or flight, and that kind of measured more thoughtful, often kinder response that comes when we take a little breath and a pause.
Both kinder to others and to ourselves.
This is on a biological basis, portions of our brain that allow us to be more compassionate to ourselves and others come online more effectively when we breathe slowly and deeply. And cranial nerves that help us read people's facial expressions and tune into their speech, they also become activated when we do this slow, deep breathing.
These are wonderful human abilities to activate, especially when we are confronting the unimaginable.
With Ukrainians still reeling from the onslaught of indiscriminate Russian missiles this week, the top U.S. general blasted the missile attacks as a war crime.
Russia has deliberately struck civilian infrastructure with the purpose of harming civilians. They have targeted the elderly, the women, and the children of Ukraine.
When I was in Ukraine, working with chaplains who were working on the front lines of the battle, and I taught them the slow, deep, soft belly breathing, I think maybe there were 20 chaplains in the group. These are military guys, Catholic chaplains. I would say 19 out of 20 noticed the change. And it was like, oh yeah, I can make a difference, because they're working in a situation which feels so overwhelming. So many people are dying. So many people have these, mutilating injuries, and they feel totally overwhelmed, partly because they're also somewhat in the line of fire, and partly because they're working with people who've been so gravely wounded and so many people who are dying. So they experience the change. The next piece is we give them tools and techniques to use their imagination so that they can begin to conceive of alternatives to the rut that trauma places us in a rut.
So how do you free people from being stuck in the traumas that they've previously experienced?
First of all, by having the experience of being in the moment. When I'm in the moment here, if I'm breathing slowly and deeply, or if I'm relaxed and talking to you, no matter what's happened to me in the past, I'm free for these moments. When the trauma is overwhelming and inescapable, instead of fight or flight, or along with it, people go into what's called the freeze response. The body kind of gets tense and collapses or becomes limp. We put out endorphins, the endogenous morphine, the morphine in our own brains, to numb the physical and emotional pain, and we take a distance from what's happened.
Is that basically fear?
It is fear, but it's fear in a situation where you can't do anything about it. They shut down, they go into the freeze response. It's a life-saving, protective response, which is important in the moment, but when it continues, it becomes disabling.
Dr. Gordon and his colleagues use various techniques to thaw that freeze response in people who've undergone trauma.
So when we get people up moving their bodies, maybe shaking their bodies, which breaks up the freeze response, and then dancing to experience a little bit of freedom.
And a little bit of fun.
And a little bit of fun. Something shifts. In Macedonia, in a refugee camp during the war in Kosovo, a guy got up, I was working with about 200 people in a tent. And he got up and he said, "Doctor, I saw 21 members of my family massacred. There was nothing I could do about it." That image, that picture has been with me in all the months. Night, I dream about it. During the daytime, I see it in my mind's eye. What can I do? And I said, well, I'm not exactly sure, but I'm very glad that you're here, and I'm very grateful and honored that you would share this experience, and I hope you'll stick around. And he said, okay, thank you, doctor. So after that, I got everybody up shaking and dancing. 200 people, from old people to little kids, shaking their bodies, freeing up themselves from that freeze response. This is a direct biological antidote to the freeze response. Then having a minute or two of relaxation, and then I put on some music and everybody's dancing. Afterwards, I see this guy waiting for me. He says, well, when we were doing the shaking and dancing, for the first time in 3 months, that image of all my family dying left. And for the first time, I thought, change is possible. I can live again. So that's what can happen. Now, he's still got a long road to go, but he had that glimpse of possibility and that experience that he could make a difference.
Coming up, a closer look at how people process their grief when they're forced to let go of the past. And now that so much in our lives is getting reshuffled, is it possible to find a new normal? When Constant Emergency continues on Humankind in a moment. You're listening to Constant Emergency, a special project from Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. For many of us, recent events have been unnerving. The drastic consequences of climate change, threats to our democracy, a worldwide public health crisis, and so much else that seems to have converged all at once. Author and pastor Susan Beaumont in Troy, Michigan, outside Detroit, has been monitoring particular challenges at this time of transformation.
For the vast majority of people, the response is a longing for simpler times. There's the desire to turn back, or the desire to rush forward to get to resolution. But for a lot of people, just the sense of remembering when things were more pleasant, easier, and just wanting to get back there.
I can totally relate. It's a kind of destabilizing moment.
Yes, it is.
It feels like we've reached some kind of cosmic inflection point. Nature seems to be commanding that we change. Such moments present opportunities to innovate and fix long-neglected problems. But for some who've grown weary from the instability, there are distinct dangers.
There is this loss of hope. And when we lose hope, we tend to lose our creativity and our imagination. If we get swept up into thinking that this is only a downward spiral and it doesn't have a productive ending, then there is that loss of hope, as opposed to understanding that this is the disintegration of systems that must fall apart in order for us to invent something that works better for us now, right? Things have to, the old way has to stop working, and we have to endure this liminal time period where it seems like we are in between something that has ended and a new thing not quite yet ready to begin, this uncomfortable place. We have to live in this place and complete some of the undoing before we can begin to delight in the emergence of the new thing.
Learning to sit with not knowing when I don't see where it's going. Cool my heels and start slowing. I'm learning to sit with not knowing. I'm learning to live with what's next. What if in my best guess? The kind of when it's a process. I'm learning to live with what's next.
The loss of hope, I think, is the biggest problem because it doesn't allow us to stand in this place with creativity kind of at its core. But I think the other biggest dangers that lurk are the rush to restore a status quo. So the great desire to get rid of the ambivalence and just settle in on something, anything. And when we do that, particularly when we rush back to the old status quo, we shut down the opportunity for that adaptation and innovation that needs to happen. So this striving on the part of leaders in particular to keep people happy by giving them something that calms them down is one of our biggest dangers. We have to stay unsettled, but we have to keep that unsettling at a level that people can tolerate. And so for leaders, the biggest danger is not being able to find that zone, right, of how unsettled can we keep people so that they keep innovating, they keep trying new things, that they don't get overwhelmed by it, but that they don't just rush back to, things are normal now. I think this is the biggest thing I'm seeing coming out of the pandemic. So many people saying, okay, this now is the new normal. And so let's just resume as much of our old stuff as we can in this new normal space. In fact, I don't think we've hit the new normal. I think this is just a pausing place. And trying to reinstitute old practices may be one of our biggest dangers.
Learning to live with the high stakes, befriending my mistakes. Lay my hand where my heart aches. I'm learning to live with high stakes.
As the ground has shifted beneath us, some aspects of the old normal may no longer be available. One example is our profligate consumption of the Earth's resources. It's a pattern that uses up a lot of fossil fuels, exacerbating climate change and the weather calamities it brings with it. The new normal will mean relinquishing some old habits. Nicole Warwick of the Sonoma, California Community Resilience Collaborative.
I think grief is the big elephant in the room that we all know is there, but we want to pretend like it's not there and we want to avoid. We want to compartmentalize and keep going and keep functioning and keep on with life so that we don't have to slow down and feel the complex feelings that come with being with our grief. And it's also, I think, the most important work that we have to do living during this time is being able to navigate and metabolize our grief.
It can mean coming to grips with an actual loss or set of losses, but also realizing that as we release part of the past, it can free up our energy to be directed elsewhere. It's a subtle, multi-layered process.
I came to understand this on a deep personal level back in 2012. I was fortunate enough to be accepted into Al Gore's climate reality training. And I gathered with 1,000 people from around the world to study climate change and how to build the momentum and the wave of policy change and system changes that we need to enact in order to address climate change.
This past summer in the American West, there were a lot of cities that broke all-time records for high temperatures and number of consecutive days with 100-degree temperature or more. 200 cities and towns in the West set all-time records.
And going through this training, I felt like something was missing because it was very much an emphasis of, here's a big problem. Lots of images of catastrophes, floods, fires, drought, devastation. And I felt overwhelmed.
It's a reaction many of us have had on learning the effects of climate change. The scale of these impacts can be mind-boggling. According to a Yale study, a majority of Americans now believe that global warming is happening and that it's related to extreme weather events.
I felt burdened by the information. I was grief-struck, but I wasn't aware of it. I didn't know how to articulate it at that time. But I knew that there was some piece that was missing for me, that I couldn't go out into the community and present this very shocking, destabilizing, existentially crisis information, and then present, a bunch of solutions. Many of them at the time were very, very expensive and inaccessible to the majority of people, to be able to make the case for why we should believe that climate change is real and happening and what we need to do to change it. There was something missing, and I just couldn't land what that was. It was a few weeks after the climate reality training that I was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer. And with that diagnosis, I came to understand the enormity of the emotions that present themselves with an existential crisis such as cancer, with an existential crisis such as climate change. And I understood what was missing was that we live in a society and a culture that is under-equipped to be able to process and navigate grief. We often hear things like, oh, time will heal it, or you've just got to get back to a normal routine, when neither of those things are accurate. We heal the grief by doing the work and feeling the feelings and moving through the process. And it's messy and it's unpredictable. It is not a linear process of now I feel sadness and then I'm going to feel anger and then maybe I'll feel acceptance. It's quite disruptive and hard to show up to, which is why I think a lot of people don't like to deal with their grief. I didn't really have a choice because I wanted to survive. I was 37 years old at the time. My sons were 12 and 15. I had every reason in the world to want to live and needed to be able to be present to this tsunami of feelings that I had experienced, and then to be able to heal myself so that I can step back in and help guide and support our community as we navigate this healing that we're going through with climate change.
Community can serve as a vital safety net in times of distress. Yet our communities are sometimes fractious as we try to harmonize with people of different backgrounds. Reverend Susan Beaumont in Troy, Michigan.
I think there has to be fundamental work right now on compassion and empathy, because I think the way we think about community is even being redefined. What is community? Who's in my community? How do I connect with that community? But at the center of being able to learn more about what the new communities are going to look like is just caring deeply about one another, trying to connect with one another, and to understand the suffering of others and to sit with them in that for a while. To not try to wrap it up in a happy bow, talk people out of their suffering, to just be present with them in it. And I think that's how we discover our way into a next chapter.
Susan Beaumont is author of How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going. She examines various ways we can think about change. Many people wanting to help take on the role of an advocate, which in some circumstances is strongly called for. But in other cases, Reverend Beaumont sees a different approach. When people are in need, she says, often they benefit most from a sympathetic ear who pays attention.
The advocator in me wants to fix your problems, wants to tell you what got you into this position and how we get out of it and how we solve this problem that you're having. The attender in me is willing for me to be present in that with you. And that's a real vulnerability, because it means I have to be present to your suffering in a way that I open myself up to it as well, that I experience it alongside of you. And there is a vast amount of suffering happening for people now.
Although suffering is something that we can relinquish to a higher power so that we don't have to be actual victims of the suffering. We can be with it, we can be in it, but not of it.
Yes, that's well said. And I think also points us back again to that surrendering. When I find myself in the midst of that suffering stance, or I'm with others who are, of saying, what if we surrender to the circumstances we find ourselves in instead of railing against them? A lot of our suffering comes from trying to rail against our present reality.
We're examining how people process the many stresses and crises that seem to have piled up in recent years. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. For more information on this segment, Constant Emergency, and to obtain audio downloads or CDs, please visit humanmedia.org. James Gordon, the psychiatrist at Georgetown Medical School in Washington, tries to offer ways people can feel safe again in their lives, and that requires an internal shift.
First of all, that there's hope, that it's possible for change to happen, having a direct experience and understanding that each of us has the capacity to make that change. So that's number one, and that's absolutely central.
Dr. Gordon is author of Transforming Trauma, The Path to Hope and Healing.
One of the characteristic features of people who've been severely traumatized is that they feel that there's no hope for change happening, and there's definitely nothing they can do to bring about change. And that's one of the most debilitating aspects of trauma. It's not just the symptoms, it's this belief that people have because of the way that trauma has, in a sense, debilitated and disabled all of their sort of cognitive and emotional functioning. So yeah, that people feel, I'm not going to be able to make a difference. So from the beginning, we assert that it's possible. And maybe as we check in, as we go around in a group, when we're leading a training, we share our own experience.
Look beyond what's happening right here in this moment. You have to widen the lens.
Sabrina and John.
So yeah, these calamities are horrible. But since I've walked through and witnessed so many of them, what I do know is that something amazing always grows through that tragedy. Lately, I've been sort of obsessed with this tree, the London plane tree, which I didn't even know what it was until recently. But you've seen it before. Anyone that's visited New York City has seen this tree. It is a tree that grows in abandoned buildings. And New York City at one point in my childhood was full of abandoned buildings. And I realized at some point in my childhood that there's this tree that in the middle of nothing, in the middle of rubble, this tree grows.
Just naturally rises
up. And I've witnessed it over and over and over again. I've witnessed the darkness, and I've also witnessed this amazing beauty grow through it. Now, of course, when I show up, I have no idea what the plane tree is going to be, but I know that it's there. And what I convey to the audiences that I've been blessed to sit with is just stay with us. Stay with yourself. Stay with your heart. Stay with every emotion that needs to come through, so that when that tree shows itself, you can see it. But I've seen it. I also believe, David, that, and people get really prickly when I say this, but all of us are designed to survive traumatic life experiences. If you look at all of the historical figures that really get us excited, we were talking about Desmond Tutu earlier, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. I'm just thinking of African Americans right now. I'm thinking about Rosa Parks and so many people that inspire me to be who I am. They had to walk through trauma. Every last one of them.
And some of them were felled by the trauma.
Oh, absolutely. And they also achieved greatness. It's a both and. But without the trauma, would they have achieved the greatness? Absolutely not. So when I'm doing my work and I'm living my life and I'm striving to live and do what I believe I'm supposed to do while I'm here, it is to remember that I'm supposed to have experiences that make me afraid, that make me angry, that make me frustrated, and that I'm also designed to have experiences that bring me joy and love and laughter.
A lot of the news we read or listen to describes a world now beset with tribulations, some quite devastating. And many people are asking a profound question. Is there action I could now take to improve the situation, or are current conditions actually beyond my control? So you have been in a number of what I would call these traumatizing circumstances where you're trying to help the people who are surviving that. And I have to assume, because you're obviously a caring, sensitive person, that sometimes this can get you down, that this can be personally challenging, kind of the feeling of being overwhelmed. So how do you cope in moments when you are personally overwhelmed?
So I want to say, I haven't met a single survivor yet whose story didn't move me to tears.
Sabrina and Jai.
So one way that I give myself permission to release that feeling of overwhelm is to give myself permission to cry. I'm very comfortable crying. And sometimes I cry with, and sometimes I cry after. I feel that the emotion that I give myself permission to feel also helps to move that sense of overwhelm. The best example I have is what's happening with so many governments. So many governments are harming people. I can't change who the president of Russia is. I can't change who the king of England, the queen of England is. I can't change those things. What can I do? But I can change the way I speak to a British man or woman. I can change the way I speak to my husband and my children. I can change this furrow in my brow that I get when my mom frustrates me. I can change my willingness to put my hand out to a stranger. And I believe that every time I do that, I am consciously aware that I am changing the energy around me, which then changes the energy around them.
How we interact with others in the world comprises so much of our personal experience and defines our own sense of well-being. This was a lesson that Melissa Barnett introduced in her work with school children in Santa Rosa, California. Fully half of the students there had lost their homes in the terrible wildfire back in 2017.
I had the opportunity to go into the schools. I worked with 15 classrooms from second grade to middle school. I was able to bring in some of these tools that we learned and teach the children how to take a deep breath. We did meditation. We did some meditative art. Different ways for them to process when they were feeling anxiety, when the storm comes, like how do you get through the storm? You know, what are the tools? I would work with the kids to find out what they already knew, what they were already using. If it was their animals that comforted them, then that was one of the things that they had in their toolbox, was the connection they had with their animals. I taught them to go outside and take a deep breath with the trees, when the air was clear, of course, and also, asking them to look around their community, their family, their friends, who was there to support them, and how can they support their family. You take a deep breath in. Peace begins with me. It's a 4-part meditation. Deep breath in. Peace begins with me. Peace begins with me. And you can say it to yourself and bring yourself back to that peaceful place, that you have the tools within your hands to be able to calm yourself.
We heard earlier that Melissa Barnett's own home had burned to the ground in that awful fire. She later moved into a makeshift trailer park provided by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They called it FEMAville. And then some of the people started planting tomatoes and flowers and playing music and inviting each other over for potlucks. Nicole Warwick.
It takes courage to show up and witness the things that we don't want to see. It takes courage to step in and act on behalf of love. Love to be given and love to be received. And I'm reminded, as somebody who's navigated a lot, and I just want to encourage people to just keep showing up, asking for help, reaching out. We don't have to do this alone. We don't have to navigate climate change or any of these catastrophes that we might experience or health crises alone. Seek support. Find the people around you who can help you, because that gives us the courage to keep going when things are hard and we're having to witness and face the things that we might not feel well equipped to do, to remember we don't have to do it alone.
You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. Studio recording by Antonio Oliart Rose. Field recording by Kobe McDonald and Zach Rosen. Editorial assistance from Kathy Graham, Ken Rogers, and Rowan Edwards. Webmaster Brian K. Johnson. Special thanks to VOA News and CAL FIRE for archival audio. And to singer-songwriter Carrie Newcomer for permission to use Learning to Sit with Not Knowing. And to Santa Rosa Community Health. Thanks also to Laura Carlo, Steve Martin, Jack Clappish, Thomas Royal, David Cruz, and Tony Buck. Our program is presented by Human Media.
To download an audio copy of this program and access other resources, please visit humanmedia.org. That's humanmedia.org. You can also access our other programs and send us an email from our website. Again, our web address is humanmedia.org.
And you can subscribe to our free weekly podcast, Humankind on Public Radio. This segment, part of our project Constant Emergency, is Humankind program number 292.
The executive producer is David Freudberg. This is Humankind.